Legend Total War here, and today I'm going to be doing something a bit different for the channel and talking about the different resistances and the different damage types. So this is kind of a tutorial on how damage is applied for Total War Warhammer 2. Now, for the most part, most times it's very easy to understand, but there are some modifiers that can apply where things can get very confusing, and this video here should cover pretty much every single type of attack possible in Total War Warhammer 2, and knowing when something is resisted or how you can go ahead and resist a certain attack and by how much. Okay, so what we've got here is the custom battle screen so that I can look at various units at a glance and basically interpret the stats here. All the information that you need to understand any unit attack is available on the unit stat information. The problem is sometimes that it can be a bit confusing on how to interpret it, so this will help with that. Now, I've also got another visual aid over here. I've created a sort of a graph, which will indicate every single type of attack possible in Warhammer 2, and also every single type of resistance possible in Warhammer 2. So, just explaining this briefly, we've got any type of a damaging ability in a rectangle, and any kind of resistance in a circle. So what I'll be doing as the video progresses is placing these circles over different types of attacks to indicate when something is actually being resisted. Now, another thing to keep in mind is mutually exclusive yes or no questions that the game asks anytime an attack is being done. So the first most important mutually exclusive condition is whether or not something is physical damage or magical damage. All attacks, every single damage in Warhammer 2 is one of these two, and they are mutually exclusive. It cannot be both. So an attack is either physical or magical. And then the next thing that it'll ask for every single attack in the game is whether or not a unit is doing a missile damage or a melee attack. These are mutually exclusive. Armor piercing and base damage are not mutually exclusive. They're just damage values. And fire damage is also a mutually exclusive. It's either a yes or no. So the way to interpret this, just to begin with, is that physical or magical, these are yes or no questions, but it has to be one of these two. And missile damage and melee attack is a yes or no question, but it has to be one of those. And fire is just a yes or a no. There is no like non-fire. That's just like, it's either fire or it's not fire sort of thing. There is no ice attack. Poison doesn't count in this situation here because poison is a status effect. These are the only things that that matter in this particular scenario. Okay, so the next thing we want to find out is examples of like physical damage and magical damage. So how to interpret it. So if we have a look at the Illyrian Reavers as an example, this is a physical attacker because it doesn't have any other modifiers, right? But if we have a look at the Phoenix over here, we can determine that this unit here does magical damage. Okay, so its attacks all fall under this sort of umbrella here because it doesn't have a missile damage. So it would do magical damage, melee damage, armor piercing damage, base damage. But if it doesn't have the fire modifier, which if we go over to this one here, so this one here does have it. It's basically that one says yes, and this one says no for fire. This, like I said, when it comes to ice, ice is not a modifier. It might be in Warhammer 3, but I kind of doubt it. But currently, ice is not a modifier. Some people, I think that there is, but there's ice makes no difference at all. Ice is usually like a slowing effect, which isn't applied by damage resistances. Okay, so the next thing to interpret is missile damage. So missiles, so that is artillery, archers, anything that's basically shooting anything is a missile damage, right? So way to interpret what type of damage a missile attack is, if we have a look at the Lothran Sea Guard, we have a look at their modifiers on the ammunition. There are no modifiers on this particular unit. That indicates to us that it is a physical, have a look over here, it is a physical attack, it is definitely a missile attack, it has armor piercing, it has base damage, and it does not have fire. So basically the questions go yes, yes, value, value, no, right? And an alternative to that is the Sisters of Avalon, right? Where you've got a magical attack, and that's also flaming attack. So basically, let's have a look at the missile strength as well. So their base missile damage is 4, their armor piercing is 18. So the way to interpret the Sisters of Avalon, right, is as follows. Basically, yes, yes, 18, 4, yes. That's how the game, like, calculates it. There's no, like, this is not numbers. This is not a number here. The actual numbers, the actual damage is applied at the armor piercing and the base damage level. But this needs to be separated due to armor. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So yeah, when asking the questions, whether it's physical or magical, you don't apply numbers to it. It's simply a on or off toggleable thing. Okay, now other examples is that some people consider that fire attacks are also magic attacks, but they're not. It has to indicate both if it is a magical fire attack. So in this case here, the Sisters of Avalon, let's do this. I'll use 4 different examples, one for physical missile fire, physical melee fire, magical missile fire, and magical melee fire. There are 4 good examples that we can use as different situations for this different types of fire. Okay, so Sisters of Avalon are magical missile fire. So sisters are here, right? Then let's look for melee magical fire. So that would be the Flame Spire Phoenix. So it's a melee attack, magical, and fire. So the Flame Spire Phoenix is here, right? So that means they go down this line here. So then let's look for a physical melee fire. And that would be a dragon. There's no magic modifier here, like the Phoenixes have. So that indicates that physical resistance is what is needed to block the Moon Dragon. Fire damage does not necessarily bypass physical or magic damage. The only thing fire damage does is deal with fire resistances specifically. So there has been a misconception in the past where people have put fire damage onto their weapons, thinking that it'll bypass either physical or magical. But the way to bypass physical is with magic. Sorry, the way to bypass physical resistance is with magic. The way to bypass magic resistance is with physical. Fire makes no difference in that situation. So, for example, in this one here, the Moon Dragon, if you were going up against someone that had 50% magic resistance, the fact that this has got fire attack here actually means nothing because it's just a physical attack. But if it had 50% physical resistance, then it would still be blocked, but 50% regardless of whether it's fire. Okay. And in terms of, what's the other one we missed? We missed physical missile fire. Okay, there is an example of that, and that is in the Dwarfs. If we go to Iron Drakes, Iron Drakes do not have a magical modifier under their ammunition, indicating that their attack, their missile attack, is a physical missile, armor-piercing, base damage, fire attack. Okay? So that's how it works with them. Alright, next thing to talk about, I guess, is resistances and how they're applied. So let's start with fire, because fire is really where it gets the most confusing. Alright? And it's literally the least effective resistance out of any of them in the game, which is why I put them at the bottom of this. I put them in sort of like ascending order. So, you know, the best to worst. Alright, so if we look at fire, what does fire block? Fire will block these situations here. So if these situations are met, fire resistance comes into effect. So in the 4 different scenarios that I showed here, if you have, let's say, 50% fire resistance, regardless of what these other effects are, the fire resistance will block 50% of the damage. So there's a good example over here if we use Dragon Princes. Okay, so Dragon Princes have 70% fire resistance and 20% physical resistance, right? So if a Sisters of Avalon was shooting at a Dragon Prince, because their attack is firstly a magical attack, that will bypass the physical resistance. So that counts for nothing. And then there's fire resistance here, right? So because they have a fire modifier, the 70% resistance will apply, which means that this attack here is reduced by 70%. Even though they have no magic resistance, that doesn't matter, because the way resistances work is that they are all added up together. So for example, if you had a unit that had 10% ward save, 10% magic resistance, 10% missile resistance, and 10% fire resistance, that would all be added up to 40%, and that would reduce the amount of damage done by the Sisters of Avalon by 40%. So it's not the case that half of their attack is flaming, and half of their attack is magical, and half of their attack is missile. It's a case of all of their attack is magical, all of their attack is missile, all of their attack is fire. That's how it's applied. It's either yes or no. And so basically, the more types of resistances that you have, it's better against enemies that have more different types of attacks. So even though Sisters of Avalon are an amazing unit, there are some units in the game that completely negate their damage. So Dragon Princes, like I said, they resist them 70% based on their missile attack. But if we were to go into melee with a Dragon Prince, because the Sisters of Avalon do physical attack, but not fire, in melee, only 20% of their damage would actually be blocked. Now, if we use the example of an Iron Drake, yep. Now, Iron Drakes do physical and flaming damage. So against Dragon Princes are 90% resistant, which is the cap, to Iron Drake's ammunition. Because the 20% physical and 70% fire resistance is added together. Now, alternatively, if a Sisters of Avalon was shooting at an Iron Drake, because they have 70% fire resistance and 35% magic resistance, these are added together to 105% because the Sisters of Avalon is both magical and fire, and it would essentially equal 90% because if you add up all the different resistances, you can at most resist it 90%. So Sisters of Avalon are terrible against shooting Iron Drakes. However, if a Sisters of Avalon goes into melee with an Iron Drake, since they have no physical resistance, the damage is only affected by armor. Alright, now let's talk about armor and how it works. Alright, so armor is only ever kicked in at the base damage level. Okay? So it only affects base damage. Let me just put it over there. And it doesn't matter if it's magical or physical. I've heard in the past people say that they think that magical damage bypasses armor. That is not true. Magic damage can bypass armor if it is armor piercing, because you can have physical armor piercing and magical armor piercing, magical missile armor piercing, you know, all the different categories there. But if we have a look over here, let's go back to the Sisters of Avalon. All right, and look at the breakdown. So if we have a look here, their base missile damage is 4, and their armor-piercing missile damage is 18. That means their armor-piercing missile damage is magical armor-piercing missiles. So if you've got loads of armor, you know, it's not really going to count for that much against the Sisters of Avalon. Now, in terms of how the base missile damage is reduced, this is something that's really difficult to sort of understand how armor is calculated. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about this, because this is actually the one thing I'm kind of unsure about. But the way that armor works is that the number that is presented here, it's randomly between that value and 50% of its value. So for example, in this case here, it basically picks a number randomly between 20 and 40, right? And that's the percentage of non-armor piercing damage, so base damage, that's resisted. So let's just say hypothetically a damage attack is being applied and it picks a 20%. Well, then it blocks 20% of the damage. Or it could pick 40% of it and block 1 damage. So that means that if you want to block up to 90% base damage of anything, and that's base missile damage or base weapon strength, the ideal numbers for armor is 180 will guarantee 90% damage block, but 90, the value of 90 gives you like sort of like a chance to block 90% of it. So it picks a number between 50% of the actual value that it's shown. So there's some degree of luck involved with armor, but once you have 180 armor, because 50% of 180 is 90, the minimum will be applied is 90. Now, I don't think there's any unit in the game that has a base level of 180 armor, but in the campaign, you can definitely get some units up to 180 armor. So that means if you've got any unit with like 250 armor, you're completely wasting those, whatever you're doing to get them that much armor, because it just becomes useless at that point. It's the same thing with like getting like 200% magic resistance. After you're above 90%, it just doesn't apply anymore. Now, armor does absolutely nothing to armor piercing damage. If you want to block armor piercing damage, you need one of these here. Okay, so missile resistance. Missile resistance will block, missile damage. Okay. And the way these resistances here, these work, is that basically if it hits the circle, it blocks everything all the way down the line. So if something is physical missile damage, which let's use let's see what's a good one for this one. I'll use one of the like Sentinels of Astral. I need Yvresse for that. Where are they? Yeah, Sentinels of Astral, because they do a lot of armor-piercing damage, right? So if you've got 90% missile resistance, so for example, if you're Morgur, you're not only blocking the base missile damage, but you're also blocking the armor-piercing missile damage by 90%. And if the attack is fire as well, well, that just doesn't factor into it because, it's just missile resistance. It only applies to... It just ignores everything else. So, again, we take Alistair the White Lion. If he's getting shot, regardless of what type of shot it is, he's blocking it by 35%. So, regardless of whether it is a gun, an arrow, or a cannonball, he's blocking it by 35%, regardless of whether it's armor-piercing or not. Okay, so, again, missiles can be either physical or magical. Now, there isn't specifically any resistance for melee damage, so the way to block melee is with either physical or magic resistance. So, if we want to block physical, so this physical resistance here will block everything in this category here. Now, what I could do is this, but if I start doing this with the effects, it'll start to get really messy when we start getting to the ward save. So the best case scenario here, I think, is just to put it up at the top like this. Okay. And that way, if physical resistance is applied, everything in this category here is being resisted thanks to the physical resistance. This is why these are more valuable, because they apply further up the chain. The earlier it's hit in the checklist, the more damage it's really, or more often it's going to trigger. And the same thing over here with magic resistance. Magic resistance will block these situations. So if you're dealing with magic damage that's missile, and you have missile damage and magic, you're blocking it sort of doubly times over. And then with ward save, see, when we go up the list here, it actually gets easier to explain. It's really these ones here that's kind of difficult to explain, but hopefully I did an okay job of that. And then ward save blocks everything without exception. Nothing bypasses ward save, right? So we can put that over everything. Okay, so that's basically how the damage resistances work. So you just add them up. Pretty simple to understand. So yeah, like I said before, if something's got 10% fire resistance, 10% missile resistance, 10% magic resistance, 10% physical resistance, 10% ward save. Now, notice how I put 50% worth of resistances in there. That is 40% resistance because these are mutually exclusive. Physical and magical are mutually exclusive, whereas none of these other ones here are mutually exclusive. So missile and fire, not mutually exclusive. Something can be fire and missile, something can be fire and physical. It can be missile and magic. And ward save just blocks everything. That's why ward save is the most valuable type of damage resistance. And why armor is just not that valuable, because a lot of units in this game have armor piercing. So it doesn't matter if you've got 180 armor, if something's got majority armor piercing. But the thing is to understand as well with armor, is that armor is never useless. It's just used less, I should say. Okay, so because every single unit in the game, even if it's got this indication of armor piercing, that is not 520 armor piercing. It's just majority armor piercing, right? So it still has 140 base weapon damage. So if you've got a lot of armor, at least you're blocking a fair bit of damage. But if you don't have any other resistances, you're always going to chunk that 380 armor piercing. Now, in terms of melee defense, that is actually chance to hit in melee, so that's not that's a different type of resistance. So that's something else entirely. Yeah, but I think we've pretty much covered everything in terms of the resistances. We've covered every single type of attack you can possibly do, and I guess another thing is spells. So spells will give information based on the tooltips, but the vast majority of the time, so spells are a bit different. Spells will oftentimes just be magical damage, and will neither be melee or missile damage. Sometimes they are missile damage. It's hard to tell sometimes. So for example, if you're using the spell Flamestorm, right? It triggers magical damage and fire damage, right? But all spells also have armor piercing and non-armor piercing. But the problem is in the tooltips, like if I showcase some of these spells. Let's see, fire, where are you? Yeah, fire. In the tooltips, it doesn't bloody tell you how much damage it does in terms of armor piercing, but it will tell you that it causes major magical and fire damage, right? So if you want to block Flamestorm, for example, you need magic resistance and fire resistance. And because I know that Flamestorm is heavily armor piercing, armor doesn't really apply that much. However, if you're going up against the Burning Head, at least it does tell you that it's weak against armor. So anybody that tells you that magic attacks bypass armor doesn't know what they're talking about, because it's just 100% not true. So magic attacks, in terms of spells, have armor piercing and non-armor piercing. It's just it doesn't tell you what the exact values are. And just by using these weapons, using these abilities, you'll eventually gauge whether or not something has a lot of like armor resistance or whatever. So for example, Fireball here, not particularly good against fire. It does magical and fire damage. Now there's some situations, like I think Beast Magic. Let me just have a look at this. Okay, if we look at the Flock of Doom, now Flock of Doom doesn't specifically say that it does magic damage, so I am unsure about whether physical damage or magical damage actually blocks Flock of Doom, but I am fairly sure that it is magic damage, because these tooltips are oftentimes wrong, because the effects that show up here, somebody actually typed it into a database. It's not based on what the effects are in the actual game. And an example of this, if we go to Beastman, if I go to Lore of the Wilds, this is an example where somebody fucked up. If we have a look at Traitorkin, where is it? Okay, Traitorkin. This is an example of how you cannot trust the effects, okay? And you just have to gauge for yourself. Alright, so if we have a look, where it says causes damage to combatants, strong versus a single combatant. What that means is it's strong versus an individual, right? So like Spirit Leech does that. But it says weak versus multiple combatants. If you've ever used Traitorkin since the update, you'll know that it's actually the opposite. Somebody just got the description around the wrong way there. So sometimes you just have to be very careful with spells. Spells could be very misleading in terms of the actual details there. The way to understand how to use spells is just use the spell, see how it works, and just gain experience and just sort of memorize how it works, because you just can't trust the information that's applied there, because human errors apply. And you know what? they might never fix this description. They might never do it. Even though it will take someone 5 seconds to do it, they might never fix it. But yeah, that's roughly how spells work. I'm pretty sure all spells are under the magical damage, but I'm not 100% sure because you'd actually have to look at the game files to do that, and I just haven't done that. So feel free to correct me about that. So in terms of Flock of Doom, I'm not sure if it's physical damage or magical, but it has to be one or the other because all attacks in this game are that way. Anyway, with that, I think that's the end of the video. I will make this image here available to you to download. So if you want to use this as a reference, you can. Hopefully that's not too messy. I'm not a UI artist or anything like that, or a graphical artist. So hopefully this can help you determine whether your attacks are effective against something or not effective. All the information that you need is on the unit cards, you know, in terms of the resistances. You can see it all here if you just look over it. And if you understand how that information is presented to you, you should know how effective your units are. Anyway, I hope this helps you. Appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.